Hey guys, today Forrest and I are going to talk a little bit about saddle fitting. So the first thing you want to do with any new piece of tack is check for safety, especially if you're buying used tack, but new tack, same deal. We want to make sure nothing's broken or close to breaking or going to give you trouble when you get to riding. So let me grab my saddle. When you got your saddle, you want to make sure our tree is in good shape. So I like to take it and try to pull, make sure I can't bend it in half. So this should be nice and firm, not going anywhere. Then I'm gonna put it on force so you guys can see better. We want to check our billets. Make sure they're not stretched out or so thin they're about to snap, or that the holes are pulling apart and not holding their shape anymore. So we want to check billets because that's what holds our saddle on our horse. Really important. You also want to check stirrup leathers. Make sure they're in good shape. Do we have dry rot where that stirrup has been hung in the same spot for 30 years and now if we move it up a hole, this part's going to break? Not stretched out. Same thing with the holes. And something to consider with stirrup leathers, a lot of people ride with more weight in one stirrup than the other, and they have no idea they do that. It's just a normal thing for us as human beings. We tend to be right or left-handed, so you put more or less weight in one stirrup than the other. So if you're using used stirrup leathers, you may find that the holes are no longer exactly the same. So you can take them off of the saddle, hold them up next to each other and see, is one stretched out more than the other? And you may have to, for yourself, switch them back and forth periodically so they stay a little more even, and that helps you stop from just putting more and more and more weight in that one stirrup than the other, because as it elongates, you're naturally gonna start putting more and more and more pressure. So keeping them even is important. So once you've assessed that the saddle is safe and not going to break on you, and the tree integrity is so important for the horse, because a saddle with a broken tree is going to cause pressure points and pinching, and it's going to be really uncomfortable for the horse. So that's really important. The other stuff is important too for your safety. But once we've decided that this saddle is safe and we want to see if it fits our horse, the first step is to put it on the horse. And I like to do this without a pad first, because ideally a saddle that really fits your horse should fit perfectly with no padding to help. So I like to put it on first a little too far forward, and then I slide it back. So let me get Forrest realigned here. Okay, and I'll do it from this side so you can see. So I start with it way too far forward, and then I'm sliding it back to where it naturally wants to sit on the horse's back. So I call that finding the saddle's home base. You're just going to find where it naturally slides down, because as you're riding, if you put it way up here first, it's still going to slide back into this home base spot. So we want it to fit where it's going to find its way eventually as the horse is moving. And if it just keeps on sliding and it doesn't ever nestle down into a spot, that's not a great sign. That's a saddle that's just going to keep on sliding off the back of your horse until it comes right off. And I've seen that happen. So we want to make sure it kind of nestles down, and then we want to make sure it nestles without being too tight. So we're going to slide a hand down and make sure we can do that in one nice, easy, smooth motion where it's not particularly pinchy at one spot or the other. Now, we also want to make sure we have enough clearance at the withers. So I like to stick just like 3 to 4 fingers in that space. For me, I do 4 fingers. I have small hands. That makes me know that when I sit in that saddle, it's not going to compress down on the withers and cause the horse pain from compression there. Okay, next we're going to check for fit and pressure points along the length of the saddle. So I take a hand and run along this way and make sure there's no gaps or especially tight spots. So sometimes you'll feel like an empty feeling space right in the middle, especially with a horse that doesn't have a very well developed top line. Sometimes the saddle won't make contact back here, like it's floating off the horse's back. That's not great either, because as you're riding, that's just going to be bouncing up and down on the horse's back and can cause them some pain. So we've checked wither clearance, we've checked for fit down the panel, we've checked or down the flap, we've checked for fit lengthwise, and then we want to make sure it's not going to rock and roll and tip and be topsy-turvy as we're riding. So pressure pommel, pressure at the cantle. The saddle fits pretty well, it's not rocking. And then I can take it and kind of pull sideways. Make sure it's not going to just slide right off of my horse, because if it does, that's going to be a saddle that gives you a lot of trouble while you're riding if you're not keeping really even weight in your stirrups with slipping and sliding. And then we want to check for the seat balance. So this is really important for you as you're riding, because it determines where your weight's going to go. So we want the lowest point of the saddle, this one's right about here, to be right in the middle. So you can use a pencil, a pen, a chapstick, anything round, little cylinder to roll, and it'll nestle right there in that lowest point, and that can help give you a visual. But we want that to be right in the middle, because if it's too far back, the saddle's up like this, then your weight's going to be way back here, and it's going to press down on the horse's low back. It's going to cause them some discomfort. It's also going to put you in a chair seat, and your pelvis is going to be tilted posteriorly. It's going to be hard for you to get up out of the saddle if you're coasting or jumping or whatever. If it's too far forward, your saddle's tipped up this way, you're going to have the opposite problem. You're always going to feel like you're rolling forward onto the horse's shoulders. You're going to put too much pressure at the withers, and that can cause the horse discomfort there. And you're going to have trouble sitting into more of a defensive position if you needed to as well while you're riding. So the seat balance is really important for you and the horse in terms of comfort and safety while you're riding. Now, if you have a saddle and you put it on your horse and it passes all those checks, that's fantastic. Then you can toss your little quilted pad, something thin, underneath, make sure it's the same steps, it's still good, and you're good to go. If you go through those checks and it's not quite right, sometimes you can use padding to help, not always. So when we're talking about using pads to improve saddle fit, I like to remind people of this analogy. If you're wearing shoes that are too tight, adding a second pair of socks is not going to help you out. Same thing with saddles. If your saddle is too narrow or causing pressure points, adding more padding underneath that tight spot is not going to help. So what we can do is fix problems with saddles that are too wide, and we can fill in spots where there's gapping. So I like the squishy, I have one right here, like memory foam kind of pads, like this one. There's a bunch of different kinds, but it's nice because it's nice and thick and squishy. So for a horse who is in training, maybe they don't have a lot of muscle development, their top line's not great, you have a saddle that we think is going to fit when they do fill out, and you don't want to buy a whole nother saddle to deal with for 6 months and then have to buy another one. So you could use a pad like this to fill in some of the depression in the top line so that that saddle fits. And then as they gain muscle tone, you can phase this pad out and it will fit them correctly. The other option are pads that have shims. So depending on the brand, they have different number of shims, but often it's 2 or 3. The 3s are great, especially if you have some gapping in the middle of the saddle. You can put the shim in the middle and fill that in. For a saddle that's too wide, you can put the shim in the front and give it a little more clearance off the withers and help it fit, and sometimes that's really effective. But what you do want to be careful of is when you are shimming a saddle in the front or back, and sometimes people do this with a little riser pad or a bumper pad to improve the seat balance for themselves. You want to be careful that that's not now making the saddle pinch in a different spot or changing where the lowest point is on that saddle for your balance. So it's a constant assessment every time you change one little thing. So that's why I say check first on the horse with no padding, and then once you decide what pads you want to try, go through every single one of those steps again, exactly the same thing, and make sure we're still checking all of those boxes, because all of those things matter and they can all change with really small changes in padding. So you'd be surprised sometimes what can make a big difference. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys. You can go check your saddles and see if they fit. If you ever have questions, feel free to ask me. I'm happy to help you guys through that process. I know saddle fitting can be overwhelming. It's frustrating. It's like the most annoying thing I deal with because it's always changing. It's a financial constraint for everybody, or most everybody, probably not everybody, but it's definitely one for me and everybody that I work with. So you have to make do sometimes with what you've got, and you've got to be creative, but we also want to make sure we're putting the horse's welfare first and making sure that they're comfortable when we're asking them to do all of those crazy things that we do with them. So hopefully that's helpful.